functions included advisor in the cabinet of the Belgian Minister for Development Cooperation and Governance Program Officer. The floor is yours and welcome, Julia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having me. Greetings from Brussels. So as we said before, I work for International IDEA. If you're not familiar with International IDEA, it's an organization, an intergovernmental organization with 34 member states that promotes democracy worldwide. So I was asked today to speak about the Summit for Democracy and how the summit has brought different like-minded actors together. So I'd like to just zoom on, first of all, who are those different actors? We've heard already in a previous presentation the number of countries that were invited. Something that we've been hearing quite a bit is, this criticism that Professor Jens also talked about in terms of who those countries were that were invited. So 110 countries were invited, as well as the United Nations and the European Union. And 98 actually accepted the invitation and attended with official statements. As we know, the Summit for Democracy was an online event in December of 2021. And what we heard quite a bit was also that there was very little, most of the representation actually at the Summit for Democracy were countries from Europe and the Americas. And the other countries, as we see here on this graph, there was little representation, for example, from the Middle East, where, very little or very few countries were invited to attend. And so, and as you all know, Hungary also was not invited to attend the Summit for Democracy. I think that's quite important for us that are working actually with the European Union on the Summit for Democracy. So when we think about all countries actually were invited to not just make statements during the summit, I'll come back to this, but were also invited to make written commitments. So that we will come back to it as well, but so that it would enable countries to push for certain democratic reforms. And so if we look at those commitments, what we see also is that some countries actually didn't submit any written commitments. There's multiple reasons. We looked into and analyzed the reasons for it, but there's multiple reasons why some countries did not want to submit any written commitments. But only, what we know is only 59 of 98 countries actually submitted these written commitments. What were the topics around those? It was, as we heard before, there was basically an invitation to make commitments in their own country promoting democracy, but also abroad. So what we see is that corruption, transparency were the most Summit for Democracy commitments, written commitments at home, and that other issues outside of corruption, such as gender equality and media freedom, were the most cited commitments for promoting democracy abroad. So if we zoom a little bit on the EU member state commitments, what we see is that actually 41% of all written commitments came from EU analysis, corruption, social rights and equality. So that's a little bit something different, where the most cited commitments domestically to promote democracy domestically. And what we've looked as well is, and this is on the right side, you see a publication which International IDEA did. We looked at also the countries for the European Union that basically European member states thought would benefit most of promoting democracy abroad. We see that the Eastern Partnership and neighborhood in Western Balkans were the main focus. Now you have to remember that the first Summit for Democracy actually happened before the invasion of Ukraine. So this was still the main focus, actually, of many of the commitments abroad that EU member states made. So what we've done as well, we developed actually a Summit for Democracy dashboard, where you can see all the EU member states and all the countries in the world and their global state of democracy according to international idea global status of democracy. And you can look at what commitments which country made, and you can also search on different commitments and see which countries made these different commitments, such as, for example, if you were interested in elections, you could see which countries made what commitments, and if those were written or just verbal commitments. I think when we think a little bit about the actors again, what I think is quite important to note, and I think again the speaker before me said that one of the objectives of the Summit for Democracy was to bring in civil society. And even if we can say that to some extent this is true, there's also been a lot of criticism that civil society hasn't been engaged to the extent that maybe many countries would have hoped for. And definitely many civil society would have hoped for. So what we have seen is that much of the civil society participation during the first Summit for Democracy was actually self-initiated. So it is civil society organizations that came together. I'll talk in a second about the Global Democracy Coalition Forum that basically came together to push for recommendations that would make it into the first summit. And one of the organizations that's been working quite a lot on the Summit for Democracy, Accountability Lab in the US, and they looked at all the events, and what they analyzed is that about 120 events related to 3 themes of the summit actually were organized. So quite a lot of civil society engagement around the Summit for Democracy. But why is it so important that civil society gets engaged? Because there's all these countries that have made commitments, it's actually good entry points for civil society organizations in these different countries to push for democratic reforms. And of course they have an important role also to look at and monitor what governments have done in the implementation of those commitments they made during the Summit for Democracy. So again, if we look at this process, what we know is, of course, there was the first summit, we've heard it. The second summit will happen actually next year, most probably during the 3rd week of March. What we hear at the moment is that it will most probably be 29th, 30th of March. And so there will be something most probably in the US, but there's also been preparation, and one of the criticisms again around the Summit for Democracy has been that it has been very US-centric, very US-focused, even though countries have been invited, but in terms of the organization of the summit. So there will also be some regional summits that will be held in different regions, so in Zambia for Africa, and South Korea for Asia, Costa Rica, and for Europe it will be most probably in the Netherlands. So there's also these regional initiatives going on at the moment. And so between this first summit and the second summit, we have something called the Year of Action. And there again, when we look at who those different actors are and what the opportunity is for those to collaborate, there's something called focal groups, which are basically government focal points that are either in the presidencies or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or different embassies, and they get together on a regular basis to discuss summit-related matters. We have regular civil society check-ins organized by the US State Departments. We had one last week around anti-corruption, for example. And then we have something called the Summit for Democracy cohorts, which is really, I would argue, at this moment, they are definitely the more sort of interesting multi-stakeholder groups, where basically civil society and governments co-lead, but invite other governments and civil society to join around certain topics. So what we know is that, of course, the Summit for Democracy had three main themes, which were fighting authoritarianism and promoting anti-corruption and advancing the respect for human rights. But through the cohorts, this has actually expanded quite a bit. And here you see a list actually of some of the cohorts that have been established. So we're talking now about financial transparency, gender, deliberative democracy, media freedom, disinformation, news, democracy, technology for democracy elections, for example. So this has really expanded the scope of these three main themes or pillars of the Summit for Democracy. And as I said, the interesting part to it is that it brings together civil society and the governments to discuss around certain themes that are important to promote democracy. And so what do these different cohorts do? Well, generally they've started off with looking at what commitments the countries have made around certain themes, but they haven't just stopped there, because in many cases, actually, the commitments that were made are very broad, very large, not always identify some of the important issues, for example. And so many of the cohorts have also started developing model commitments. So if a government were to do a commitment around electoral integrity, for example, what would be some of the things that they could consider? So that's been done by quite a few of the cohorts we know of. The other thing that some of the cohorts have done is consider actually that the Summit for Democracy is only one of the milestones and that it should go further. So for example, the deliberative democracy cohorts, they're developing all kinds of different projects because they've come together and they've developed advocacy campaigns, and the Summit for Democracy is only one of the actions actually that will take this work forward, or one of the milestones, but they really already have the aim for this to continue, despite the fact that we don't really know whether there will be a third Summit for Democracy or not. So this is already quite important for the sustainability of the whole process. Again, what we see is that there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration. There's been a lot of collaboration around the Summit for Democracy because through the commitments, a lot of the countries, including here, I've cited some European countries, have joined different coalitions, different partnerships that were partly already existing or that were launched during the Summit for Democracy. But this definitely the Summit for Democracy definitely has given quite a bit of momentum to the field of democracy promotion and to different coalitions. One that I would like to mention is this Team Europe Democracy, which is quite important for the European Union because it is one of the ways of the European Union and its member states coordinating democracy assistance in the world. So they're coming together around this Team Europe Democracy with some countries actually in the EU being in the lead in collaboration with the European Union to push the issues of accountability, rule of law, political and civic participation, and media and digital. So again, this is something that the summit has sort of brought to the spotlight, and some of the EU member states have within their commitments abroad referred to this Team Europe Democracy initiative. So now just very briefly, something else I want to talk about is this Global Democracy Coalition, because it is important to bring in different actors together. So what happened is a few days before the Summit for Democracy, on the 7th of December 2021, International IDEA with some other partners organized together with 52 democracy organizations, organized this global forum. So during 24 hours, basically, there were about 240 speakers from 50 countries that came together to discuss democracy, the threats to democracy, and basically came up with these recommendations that fed into the first Summit for Democracy. But then beyond that, the collaboration was so useful, basically, that this global democracy coalition continued, and currently there's about 84 partners that are part of this coalition, and they've done now partner mappings, looking at what different organizations are doing in the field of promotion of democracy. So they're really coming together through this democracy coalition. And also they've done a Ukraine campaign. They continue to do quite a bit of work on promoting democracy during the International Democracy Day. And again, doing regular webinars to keep civil society informed about what's happening in the field of democracy promotion, but of course also within the Summit for Democracy. So just to conclude, I think what I would say when you think about collaboration and opportunities for different actors to collaborate, I would definitely say that the Summit for Democracy has, in the process itself, has brought quite a lot of opportunity to highlight democracy at international level, mainly because obviously there's been a high level of political engagement from, Prime Minister, presidents, all the way up, but also going downwards into the cohorts. There's been, as I explained before, there's been quite a bit of momentum with the establishment of these Summit for Democracy cohorts. There's been a lot of, more and more civil society consultations, also more recently, as I said, by US states, but also through the coalition, for example. But what's really important is, and that's where I think there's been less focus, is the engagement at national level, because in the end, these commitments were taken by governments for their citizens. And we have, at the International Idea, we started to do some surveys in a couple of countries. And what we found is that approximately 75% of civil society organizations that work in the field of democracy promotion at national level have never heard about the Summit for Democracy, and have never heard about the commitments that their governments took. So this idea of monitoring and implementation, monitoring the commitments is of course a good one, but it starts with raising awareness of civil society at government, at country level, so that they know what kind of commitments their countries took, and they can push for the governments to implement those. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me, and yeah, please don't hesitate if there's any questions, I think, later on.
Thank you very much, and thank you both of our panelists so far, and I encourage you to stay with us for the question.